based on a true story. You saw that in 2022. They can be your competitors on a deal in the future. How this got started was when the story broke, besides it being on all the news reports that you heard in the movie, there was an article written up in Rolling Stone magazine. And Bradley Cooper read the article and was just flabbergasted that it happened and decided to produce a movie. So he was producer and director for this movie and brought the screenwriters together to write the movie and all that kind of thing. What's fascinating, what I got a kick out of was when they interviewed him at the opening, they had a panel discussion afterward with some of the key players, and he said to the group, and here's the crazy thing, because they'd all just seen the movie, and he says, it's all true. He goes, and here's the crazy thing. He said, the federal government, they still have this system called FedBizOps, and they still do things this way. Like that part was just so shocking to him. Not speaking this language that you're all learning right now, that part was just so shocking to him that we were still doing this and the government still opening itself up. And the reason why I use this movie with Admirals and Generals is because for as many checks and balances as the government has, and if you're a distance from the government, you may not see it. I'm in agencies every week, and there are a lot of checks and balances, and yet this kind of stuff happens. And it's incredible at what they were able to get away with for as long as they were able to get away with it. And I'm faulting these two people that made up AEY, but there's equal fault to be played on the role of the government because there were certain things that had to have seemed to be issues and that never were caught. So, all right, so this idea of that he was impersonating, that's a key issue. What else did you jump out at you?
Was paying the cash for the arms when they got there, did that really happen?
So, did you see that?
Oh, big vaults of money. Those exist.
Yeah.
I mean, they'll be. I've heard being in the Air Force, being around pilot types. They may pick up somebody with a few briefcases and like cargo pilots. Just don't ask them any questions. You drop them off here. See it because you don't want to read pilots and stuff. But yes, that in a location like that is.
Yeah, it's got to be a cash-based, and a lot of it's, when you go overseas, there's a lot of stuff done on bribes, and so they have to have ready cash. With war issues, the way contracting is done in war times is very different than the normal federal procurement process.
What I was going to say was the delivery. I thought that was very strange.
Which delivery?
Of the guns,
Mhm.
and then they were paid the cash. Two guys that, I don't know, that just seems so odd to me.
Yeah, so let's talk about why did they get that? Why were they delivering the guns?
They couldn't run in the air. I mean, they were gun runners. That was their job, was transporting the.
No, they were gun runners because they totally screwed up the contract, right? So there are ITARs, which are international trade arms regulations, that govern who we are friends with at any point in time and where things can be established. And other countries have the same type thing. So in this case, Italy had decided that they weren't going to deliver any guns to Iraq or Afghanistan. And when you're in government contracting, you're supposed to be tuned into stuff like that, particularly something as sensitive as Berettas, which are only manufactured in Italy. So the fact that they got themselves in trouble because they didn't pay attention to the regulations is what started that, because there's no way they should have been delivering those
No,
themselves.
that's what I thought. That
Right.
there should have been the paperwork finished and
Yeah.
completed.
And then how do you feel about your taxpayer dollars being spent to send that Black Hawk helicopter in to get those guys' rear ends out of the war zone? Because,
How bad do we need the Berettas?
But was it
Berettas that bad, I'm okay with that.
were they really sent to just save them though? That wasn't really, or did they just happen to show up? Leaving the base, you don't really know if that's the reason they were there.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm also kind of amazed that the Capitol was able to procure Berettas without going through other chains. I'm sure that seemed to be a tad bit you know.
Yeah, so, and you don't know whether, because I think a lot of times, and you want to talk about your story?
Well, talking about having the helicopter come in and all that stuff, they were in the green zone, so the Baghdad International was just like a mile up the road. They made it seem like it was some long journey or something that it really wasn't. And most of the time in their contracts, it would have if we provided the security or, if they provided the security. So we would, get Blackwater, XE, whatever they were that year, or any other random security company to take us places. But the truth of it is, just like them going across the border, it was just easier. So if we did a convoy, say we had, like we did satellite communications, secure and non-secure. So if we had to go to Fallujah or Ramadi or wherever, so those areas would have something for that day, some kind of security intel report or something like that. And so based off that report, we would just kind of flip a coin, and we could wait a week when the next military convoy was going, or we could get a little bongo truck that looks just exactly like the truck that they were carrying that stuff in and just drive down the road.
Take your chances.
And most of the time it's easier. It is a small company, it was really easy to maneuver over there because large companies had all the overhead and the red tape and stuff like that. And most of the time the larger companies would call us and say, hey, can you get this over into that area or what have you.
Yeah, and when you think about just when it came the Albania deal, and they did the right thing when they went over to check the supply of bullets that were there. And they didn't check all the bullets. And, they just pulled out one that was U.S. based and they thought they were okay. They didn't look at the rest of them. They could have done like a random sampling of many more than just one, which would have solved that problem. But did you hear when the Bradley Cooper character said, you have to stop confusing our problem with your problem? That's a subcontract issue. Because if you're the prime and you have all these obligations imposed on you, you have to impose them on your subs. Because in this case, the sub didn't have any of those responsibilities. It just said produce the equipment, and the prime was left holding the bag.
I have a question. So, it did happen, but when that happened and Italy came out and said they weren't going to ship those guns or anything, so are they they're still obligated to fulfill that contract? So, what would have been the right thing?
So, first off, to know what the requirements were, because they weren't paying any attention to any. There was no mention of the FAR in there. They weren't tuned in any of that. And quite honestly, your competitors aren't tuned into the FAR. I've worked with many companies where I've gone out and they've been totally focused on what the technical requirements are and have not looked at the rest of the sections of the RFP. And all the stuff is in these other sections of the RFP. So if you're not paying attention to it, you're putting your company at risk because you're signing up for things that you may not be able to live up to. So they would have had to figure out a different way to get it in. So, maybe it would have been like a 6-month process to get the actual permit, and they would have had to take a hit on being late on the contract in order to comply. Or they could have been proactive and said to the government, the government would have expected them to be aware of that. So the fact that they're going in after the fact, the government has every right to terminate them for default, which is, what they were trying to avoid with that whole situation. And also, which is why the captain was so surprised to see him show up, in his base carrying the Berettas, because obviously most companies wouldn't do that, take that risk on. What else jumped out at you?
The fact that he was talking to the captain, that's not who you would talk to, is it?
In other words, the captain was the one that initiated the RFP, it sounded like.
Yeah, okay, so just keep in mind that things are just done differently in war.
Okay.
So the captain could have been the program manager who actually needed those goods and services, he could have been the contracting officer representative, meaning he was like they had to bring him to him so that he would sign off and accept. Obviously, that whole invoicing process didn't work, they just walked over and they were handed cash. That's not the way. I mean, it's done that way in war zones, it's not done that way normally. And then I mentioned this, but I just want to state it again since you've seen the movie. So, you know, you look at this whole thing and you say, oh, I wonder how much of it was, you know, Hollywood Liberty. And there was a guy in my class who actually had pictures of those boxes and then down to the bags and how they started off in these Chinese, like, he was one of the government corps responsible for accepting this stuff. So, and it was funny because he said he knew the movie had come out and it frustrated him so much as a government employee that this company was able to get away with as much as they did, that he said he personally could never watch the movie. Because he just said it was, like, it just really, really bothered him that so many of the checks and balances fell down. What do you think about DOD knowing that there's a worldwide supply shortage of that ammunition and still requesting it?
Yeah.
Well, they were very lax. I mean, because if there was such a discrepancy in the bids, don't you think that would be kind of a red flag to question that a little more?
Yeah.
They were just looking at the deal.
I'm sorry?
They were just looking at the deal.
Yeah,
They were
so-
looking at how cheap they were getting it for.
Right, so a couple things here. One is, I've taught at some Intel agencies. I haven't done Intel specific work. And I know Intel can do a lot of things that we don't know about. So, like, putting that aside, the fact that they were $50 million less expensive than the next highest bidder should have caused the government to do a more careful evaluation. Now, if this was an Intel type buy and the government didn't care where they got it from as long as they got it, like I don't want to make any assumptions about the Intel side of the house, but you know, that could have been an issue, the fact that they knew that they couldn't get it themselves, they were going to have contractors do it, and then that's how they ended up with the situation. Those are all, you know, that's sort of a different category, but think about these guys showing up high to the meetings, and then just being so, like, they didn't do their competitive analysis to know that they were going to be $50 million short. What about doing business with Bradley Cooper? Yeah, on the terrorist watch list, and yet, you know, this is the direction that they think. Okay, other comments?
They did change their partnership after the award, or they signed the paperwork for that, and you can't do that.
Okay, so let's talk about that, okay? So, in theory, friends, right? The guy shows up to the funeral, not because he cares about the dead guy, he cares about wanting to see his friend and wasn't able to get his number from his mom. So even that friendship, greed took over in the Ephraim's mind, right? And look what it caused him to do. It caused him to screw the customer, the Albanian company that was doing all the repackaging. It caused him to mess around with Bradley Cooper character, and Bradley Cooper, of course, took it out on his partner. It caused him to rip up that agreement between the two of them so that he had no account. It caused him to lie to the Jewish guy who thought they were supporting Israel. I mean, think about how greed motivated all those decisions. Now, my point in bringing that up, that very moralistic, is all of you are good people, right? And I don't know what his characterization was. It sounded like he was messing around with his uncle from the get-go. So he's messing around with family, friends, customers. I mean, nobody was, you know, out of his reign of terror. But, you know, you're going to be, like, there are going to be companies out there that aren't ethical. And to be honest with you, I worked for companies that weren't ethical and stopped working for those companies. So, you know, you have to decide what kind of business person you're going to be in the federal government space, knowing that there are, you know, it's primed to make sure you are ethical and you stay an ethical contractor, but because because the government has this mission that they're focused on, you heard what the guy said, you know, he wants to be able to shoot the Barettas, he wants to be able to kill the enemy, he needs them. And you compare that with a company's motivation, where in this case, they were so drugged all the time, they're dealing with prostitutes, I mean, they're leading this morally bankrupt life, and they're using this contracting as a way of just, you know, like having, you know, $5 million wasn't enough for them. You know, they had to go for the $30 million, you know, and if this wouldn't have happened, they would have kept going. So my point is that you're going to be up against all kinds of different contractors, right? The ethical ones that are going to handle business just the way you do, and ones that are doing totally inappropriate, unethical things. So there's good and bad to that, right? If your competitors are constantly doing drugs all the time, chances are you're going to be able to put together a better proposal than they will. They probably won't even be able to get it in on time. So you have, you know, there are some really bad contractors out there that are your competitors that you'll end up, you know, if you know your stuff, will come off much better. But on the flip side, there are ones that do pretty screwy things. Who else has something?
You keep taking all my good words.
The forged documentation
Yeah.
turned out to be pretty extensive.
Right, so that part was, they needed like a procurement expert in to help them with some of that stuff. So one of the errors there was, the government does conduct a responsibility evaluation on you. So they have to make sure that you have the financial wherewithal to do this contract. You know, if you need any special licensing or bonding, they have to make sure that you do that. You know, if you've been banked, if you filed Chapter 11, they're going to check on that stuff before they award a contract to you. So they do that evaluation. But they were comparing that evaluation and they were lumping it with all this invoicing support. And what we heard was that they were relying on all those invoices. So on a GSA schedule, if you're going to go after a GWAC, like a GSA schedule, you have to show for everything you're offering the government what your price is. And not just, oh gee, I want to start making $150 an hour on this person. You have to show invoices from customers that actually paid that amount to you for that particular labor category or for that particular product or service. So that invoicing support is you have to show at least 3 different invoices to demonstrate that companies or agencies have paid that amount. That's one way that they can show that you're competitive. Because in the open marketplace, customers have paid that amount for you. So they were kind of combining those 2 things. But yeah, they were lying about all of it.
And to pass an audit with fake invoices and all that.
A little questionable, isn't it?
Well, you know, I worked for the state for 25 years. Where we done procurement that was VCO certified. And when we have an audit, I mean, you know, they would walk in and, on a state level, do a lot more than they did there. So that really surprised me that they passed the audit.
Yeah, so there are those of us contractors that go above and beyond and put our best foot forward, and there are some contractors that just do the absolute barest minimum. Same thing happens in government agencies, right? You've got people who are going above and beyond and protecting your dollars as taxpayers, and others are just, let's check the boxes and get this done as quickly as possible so I can get out of here at 5. You know, so again, it all depends on who you get and you know, how extensive the audit was.
Would a government agency ever call you to discuss your bids, proposals, and that kind of thing? The way he was tricking the competitor in the beginning of the meeting?
The government will conduct phone interviews with you for the purposes of market research. So if they're trying, and we'll talk about market research, but if they're trying to check the box of market research, they might pick up the phone and call 3 of you that provide the same products or services and say, just give me, but this is just for informational purposes. They wouldn't make a contract award based on that. They're just trying to get information.
Would they ask pricing and what you're going to bid?
Well, they would ask your pricing, but it's not in an active procurement. So they would never during an active, okay, let's caveat it that way. They could call you up tomorrow and ask you your prices. And you should feel perfectly comfortable giving it to them because they're just trying to gather information. And again, you want them to know you, and so, try to get those 10 contacts with them any way you can. But if there's an active procurement, there's a law called procurement integrity, which doesn't allow them